Mr. Stone, Father Clark.
Thank you. Thank you, Eileen, for helping us with the technical aspects. We're here. This is the third session of Peace in the Parish and Beyond webinar. This is the afternoon of September 30th, 2014. We'll start this as we usually do with a prayer, and then we'll move into the actual material today.
Gracious God, we thank you for the story of creation, the story of life itself, and the stories that each of us are. We recognize that sometimes these stories and perceptions clash, and so we continue to pray for the grace, the wisdom, the fortitude to come to a place of understanding and truly hearing, listening to each other's stories, we might reach peaceful resolutions. In Christ's name, the peacemaker of all, we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Father Jim. We're webcasting from St. John's Seminary in Camarillo. This is number 3. Now, at the end of last week, in session 2, we had a technical glitch. The Wi-Fi here cut out. We hope that doesn't happen today. If it does, we have a way of correcting that, so stay with us. But what I wanted to do is touch on some of the ideas that we were going to cover in that last couple minutes of last week. And so we go to the slide that we had last week, and we talked about the hidden influence. We were talking about what if you're in a situation in which you're trying to convene a mediation, trying to convene a facilitated conversation, and it's just a no-go. You're just hitting a brick wall. Well, one of the things that you can look at is the idea of the hidden influence, because we can see the problems that are present. They're obvious, they're in front of us, and we can see it. And often we forget that it's the thing that we can't see that we must take into account. And so at that point, if your assessment just isn't making sense, it's not moving forward, consider the hidden variable. In a very special case of the hidden variable, though we find this in just about every conflict, is what we've called the destructive third party. This is also the gossip, the character assassin. This is the person, as the diagram shows, who's talking to both, either one or both, and it can be weighted. It isn't a 50-50, but certainly you find the influence is working with both parties and driving the conflict. And typically they're not aware of it. They've overlooked this. And a scenario, just to explain this, is the destructive third party talks to party number 1 and says, well, you know, party number 2, just use caution. I mean, you've heard about him, right? Party 1, suddenly there's a little bit of distrust. Goes to the second party and delivers a similar message. And suddenly the party 1 and 2 are looking at each other with distrust. Now that they've been set up, they both see distrust in the other, and the whole situation just spirals out of control. We see this in a very potent way, in a strong way, in the story of the garden in Genesis. The serpent in that case is the destructive third party. And we find that model. I mean, Genesis gives us a mystical understanding of the world that we find ourselves in. And we see that model played over and over again in the fallen world. So this is such a basic model and such a foundational model in terms of the theology of conflict that it's worth paying attention to. There's very few conflicts that don't have this component.
In effect, what we're talking about is a real power base, that this person, in effect, is operating from the place of not only just negative influence, but a type of power that can sink all the parties concerned.
That's right. Organizations, institutions, cultures
Yes.
can be sunk by this kind of activity. We see this used very blatantly, typically in the war situation, where there may be one country or one financier who's undermining the relations between two countries. The distrust ratchets up, and the next thing you know, we have war. It's very, very common. And I know this is something that St. Francis really disliked. You find in the stories of St. Francis and in his life, you find this was a situation he abhorred. And it was interesting, a year ago, in a number of his homilies, Pope Francis addressed this subject, addressed the gossip and the damage the tongue can do, out of the book of James, out of the letter of James, which we know. So this is something that you'll want to check from time to time. Now, you may find it in the convening stage, which is it's an impediment to your even bringing the parties together. But it's also the kind of thing that can appear in the actual mediation itself. And I find that when you identify this, you're paying close attention to this variable, and when you can identify it, the change is miraculous. I was in a court mediation. It was a civil harassment. It was a horrible situation where, to make a long story short, and to not breach confidentiality or talk about the actual parties, but the situation had to do with a single mother with young children, and the family lived nearby who had a teenage son. And there was a horrible accusation that had now reached the court. When I read this, I said, oh, they do not want this to go in front of the judge. They do not want a restraining order in this situation, because both families are going to suffer greatly. They may lose custody of their children. They'll be on the sexual abuse database. And basically the rumor that had been floating around is that the teenage son was having an affair with this single mom. And usually I put parties in the separate room to start. In this case, I went against that. The instinct was that no, I needed to see them together. And sure enough, as I listened to the story, it became clear that there was a destructive third party in the neighborhood who had used the small children to create and spread a rumor. And so it was all rumor. The children saw it as drama. But two families were almost ruined. And the minute I pulled the string and said, you know, could this be happening? Both parties broke into tears. And because I could see as it was going along that there was no real animosity between them. They really, really were seeking reconciliation. And so once the truth of the situation became clear, it was amazing. They just leapt up, hugged each other, and the tears flowed. And that's how powerful this can be. So I just said, don't overlook this. It's there. It's a classic. So now let's move on into something that borders a little bit in that same area. This is something that we do so frequently, and that's make a false attribution. There's a term in the dispute resolution literature called false attribution error, FAE. And what this is to best describe it, is when we commit a transgression, we continue to write our own inner story as if we're wearing the white hat. We excuse ourselves based on the situation. Well, just the elements of the situation made it happen. Or we may even go as far as just say, hey, it's human to err. So we maintain this self-image, but we don't write the story for the other party in the same way. We don't know their inner story, and so what we do is we falsely attribute to them negative emotions, negative disposition, evil, and so we write the inner story of the other person different than we write our own story. And so we end up in a situation in which we have falsely attributed motive, character, disposition to another party. And this is a tough one to overcome, because that's the reality that someone's working in. So what we do in the mediation, the tool that we use to overcome this is to hear each other's story. Because when we can hear the other person and their inner story, suddenly we have to redraft our story, because now we have more information. So that's why we tend to want to go to story as quickly as we can in these situations. And so then there's the question of how do we do that? And typically a mediator starts with just an open-ended question. What happened? Tell me what happened. And there's a reason why we want to do that and make it so open-ended. If we start to ask questions that focus the party, we are adding bias to the story as they would tell it in their own words. An example is typically parties will go into a lawyer's office. They're having a dispute, and maybe there's a court case coming up, and they think that the lawyer wants to hear about the dispute in legal terms. That's what he does. He's a lawyer. Let me tell him all about the legal aspects. And often this really hurts the attorney because he doesn't know the true full story. I was in one mediation and co-mediating with the judge, and it was a situation like this where we just kept hearing things that didn't make sense. And finally I pulled the string and asked one party who was there but hadn't said anything for some information to clarify what was going on. And sure enough, this case, which had legal grounds and these beautiful legal briefs and these wonderful lawyers down charging $500 an hour, when this information came out, it turns out it wasn't about a legal matter. It wasn't about a trademark violation. Instead, it was about a love affair. It was about an affair that took place between the client and the other party, and it fell apart, and there were all these hard feelings. And so they were using the legal system to litigate, to punish the other party. And so the actual dispute, of course, once we drew this out, the lawyers said, "Oh, do we have a timeout? We need to speak with our client." So that can happen where if the client figures, well, I have to tell the story in this manner, we're not going to get the full story. So we want to go at it in a very open-ended way. And telling your story it becomes different than make your case, present an argument. In our culture, we tend to get into that mode of, tell your story. Well, that means I have to argue my case, and that's not what we want. So as a mediator, we remind the parties that we're not judges. We don't make a decision. And this would be the same in the role of a priest operating as a mediator, is assuring them, I do not operate as a judge. I'm here to hear your story and walk alongside you and see if we can't find a way to resolve this that helps you. And
this is why going to confession for Catholics or spiritual direction and of course pastoral counseling seem to work for so many people, because it is an opportunity for them to not only tell their story, right, but to really experience a listening ear and a listening heart.
Right. And that's an important point, because I'm not certain, I don't have the research, I just have anecdotal. I'm not sure how many people understand that's the manner in which the rite of reconciliation is now conducted.
Very much so.
They may be thinking along adversarial lines, if you want to call that, okay, it's right and wrong, and it's not this assistance walking through this minefield that is the spiritual pilgrimage. Mm-hmm. So we must become a community of listeners, in a sense. I mean, that's one of the big tools that we can use to diminish conflict within the parish, is spend the time to listen in a non-judgmental manner. This story that we get into, and once we start hearing the story, it can help a mediator to become familiar with what's called the hero's journey. This is basically the dramatic formula that we see on the screen, we see on television, we see in plays. And there's a wonderful book. It's listed in the. I provided a file of references that you may want to access. And there's a book called The Writer's Journey, and it has an interesting history. It started out as a memo at Disney, and it was a memo for writers so that they could see the Disney formula, which of course was the classical formula of Greek drama. And so it's a wonderful book, and it helps a mediator understand what are the parts, the elements of drama, because that's how people are going to tell their story, or we can help them tell their story that way. And it's real interesting. You see on the hero's journey, and you'll see the parties do see themselves as the hero on their own journey. You know, outsiders may not see them as a hero, but inside they are a hero working against great odds. And the heroes are symbolic of souls and transformation. And they move from a common world to a region of supernatural wonders. And the story poses questions about hero. Of course, we recognize this comes directly from the faith journey. This is the basis of where drama comes from.
Not only that, very often the story of the hero is juxtaposed to the story of the victim. That if one can't, have the top position and they take the bottom position, and so often for us as listeners, we seem captivated by one perspective or the other, but it's hard to hold the tension of both, realizing that there are heroes in our midst and victims in our midst, both within us as well as those around us telling us their individual stories.
Yes. And also, as we go on to the next slide, we start to look at these elements and we realize that most stories are going to have a villain, an antagonist, or someone who's seen as the problem here, which leads to the ordeal, which is exactly the same as what we've defined as conflict. It's the confrontation with an opposing force. And we've qualified that as a conscious agent exercising free will. And there's something to be gained or lost. Often, like in a lawsuit, that's very clear. There's a claim made. In the brief is, a claim statement of what the party deserves, the petition for what they want. Sometimes parties don't clarify that, so you need to help them clarify that in something that hasn't been formalized. Then there's the test, the traps and events that they see themselves facing. And then we get to a crisis in the story, which is a partial or first death of the ego. This gets back to what we were talking about the false self, where suddenly in a conflict, the party's realizing, okay, what part of me needs to die in order to move this forward? And we go on to an elixir as a vehicle for the medicine, which of course for us is the gospel, the healing message of the gospel, and the epiphany, which of course is the realization that you're a child of God, that you're endowed with the image of God. Catharsis is, all the emotional release, what we talked about last week, how we have to deal with the emotions. The ordinary and special world, we return with lessons. It's very interesting that this can be approached, and we can understand this in terms of the special world when we take part in the Blessed Sacrament and we're there with the real presence. And then we return to the world. So we are making that journey back, and we do return with lessons. And when we understand that, that can become a huge part of resolving conflict, that someone is doing well on their faith journey in that way. And the climax is, again, the death, and must experience a resurrection, which of course is the death of this false self, of the ego, which Paul addressed so well in his letters, and particularly in Romans, where we go through this transformation in which we then have Christ within us. And this is, as we see, this is all modeled in the dramatic storytelling. And one thing that we may, as a church, do at some point is look at, how has the culture grabbed the storytelling away from us? And could we be better at telling our story? Could we be better at using this model, which is exactly the model of our faith journey? Could we convey this in a better way so people start to understand this is their story as well? There's steps that the character goes through in a drama, which are just the same as the mediation arc. Increased awareness of the problem, reluctance to change and overcoming that reluctance, and then committing to that change. So the model is very similar. And this is just a tool that the mediator can use to go, in a sense, assess how are we doing? How's this coming along? What area needs help? Mm-hmm. Now I know I've read your work and have great admiration for what you've done in the area of ritual, because that kind of parallels this area and speaks to that, I guess what in mediation would call the softer techniques that are transformative and yet end up being the most powerful techniques that we have.
Absolutely. Traditionally, amongst Native peoples, cross-culturally, rituals were used in conjunction with their great mythic stories as a way of reenacting the story and recreating a new cosmos or a new life. And these particular rituals were created not just for individuals, but for the community as a means of being able to not only resolve the conflict situation, but to help them to move forward. So, for example, in times of transition, or times of great emotional intensity, or times of emotional impasses, or necessity of letting go of an undue attachment. But these are the four main areas where rituals were used and found to be extremely helpful amongst peoples of long ago. And thankfully, this understanding of rituals is now being reclaimed in this whole arena of conflict resolution, and can be a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. I found it both personally and professionally helpful in using both what Greg is talking about in terms of listening with new ears, and ritual is kind of acting with a new heart, a way of putting into practice the desire of one or both parties, and that is for effective ongoing mediation and a change or transformation in the prospect for the future.
I know sometimes it seems difficult at first to represent accurately the power of these kind of processes. There's a bit of skepticism, and I guess I don't know what your experience is, but I think the entry point is tell me your story. Yeah. Tell me what happened.
Very much so.
And that starts the ball rolling.
Starts the ball rolling. And I found, for example, like amongst divorce proceedings, can be a very volatile area. Or situations where one or both spouses have been unfaithful to each other. Even in terms of, like, say, the entry or the exit of a child from the family home, these things can be highly emotive. But a ritual can help express either the undefined emotions or the underexpressed emotions, but also to clarify the story in such a way that can be entered in a new way, with new eyes and new heart.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we're doing in mediation, is we start with the story that the parties tell us. And obviously the two stories that come in are very different.
Yes.
I mean, I laugh a lot of times when you go in, if you're meeting in separate session, you meet with the first party and then you're ready to go to the other room, and you're just thinking, boy, the people I'm going to meet in this room they are really a piece of work. This is going to be, you get in the other room and it's a different story, and they're wonderful people too. And you see this mismatch of story, and so as a mediator, one thing you're helping them do is rewrite not only the story of the past, so that it becomes acceptable, where both parties, even though it's a different story, even though my story may be different from your story, at least we can reach a point in which we can say, okay, I can accept that that's your story.
Yes.
Now from that platform, we can move forward and write a new story for the future. What does that look like? And that's a key thing, because the parties themselves are creating that new future. The next slide is just a number of steps that a person goes through. A lot of what we're doing here is presenting an outline and pointing to things. You can print these out from the PowerPoint, and also you can go to the text, the book, for more information on those things. So what we're doing in this presentation is really just touching on these things and saying there's an area here that is important to be considered as you try and handle these situations. The idea of a funnel comes from just an idea of how do we go about interviewing people. And we've kind of set this up, but it's even, we need to put a little focus on that. And let's start with that open-ended question. Let the parties present this in their own words, because that's a way that you're going to find out what's important. Now, there may be more to the story, but when you hear it in their own words, open-ended, what happened, then you're going to get the information that you need to really make a difference. And this is a fairly important point, clarifying questions. These are questions that you're going to need to ask in order to clarify something that they've said. Always, in this case, gain permission before you even start by saying, you know, I'm going to ask you to share with me what happened. Now, after you're done, I may not understand everything. You're the expert on this dispute, and I may not understand everything. So would it be all right if at that point I could ask some clarifying questions? And the reason you do that is because if they tell you their story, and then you start to ask questions, it's perceived as a challenge. He's challenging my story. He doesn't believe it. You see, he's trying to impeach me. So very important to bring that up ahead of time. I'm going to do this. Is it all right with you if I do that? And now, and this is one of the things that you use in mediation, is it's a very transparent process where you try and keep the parties informed. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what I'm going to do. And so everything is, the parties know what's taking place.
It's a good adult education model, by the way, because so often information is withheld and we feel handicapped or imprisoned by our lack of information. So that's excellent.
Yeah. Closed-ended questions are just at the end where there's a detail. You know, the light was red or green. Oh, okay. It was at this time. It's where you get the specifics in case you're going to need those later. Wonderful book called Difficult Conversations. This could be a good addition to the bookshelf at the Parish. It's written by authors who are part of the Harvard Project on Negotiation. They've written some excellent books that are designed for the layperson. They're fairly easy to access, and so there's a link to this as well. One of the key ideas that they put forth, which is valuable to keep in mind, is the multiple conversations that are taking place at one point. The what happened conversation is a conversation that has to do with the facts. Okay? You know, when did this happen? How did it happen? What took place? And at the same time that you're hearing what happened, you're going to hear the feelings. There's a whole feelings conversation taking place. And that needs to be acknowledged as well. If you overlook that, the person is not going to feel like you really heard them. So the feelings are important. And the other is the identity conversation. Is what do these events say about who you are? How did that make you feel? And what did that say about who you are? Were you disrespected? Were you made to feel small? Whatever that is. So there's an identity. So we learn to listen in a broadband way so that we're listening at multiple levels all at the same time.
Now, this is especially important not only with individuals, when we're working with individuals, but for example, either two separate groups or two separate couples. Very often I have discovered in these situations that one or more people will be much more interested in the identity aspect of the conversation, or another group be interested strictly in the facts, another the feelings. And to be able to, almost like an expert juggler, to be able to come back and forth and to clarify and to ask open-ended questions to help people to express all three layers and levels, I think is extremely important for understanding to take place.
You know, this can be applied. There's a special model, and we'll get into this in a later session, but it's a model called the learning conversation, and it's for use with groups. And the idea behind it is maybe you'll have some presenters, and they'll present some background, some foundational information on that topic. And then you let the parties in small groups discuss it, and what will come up are the feelings, what happened to them personally, and how that makes them feel about who they are. And learning conversations I know it's what I think a lot of people were attempting, but maybe with not great success right after Vatican II. when we had the term dialogue. And that maybe got sent off in other directions, whereas a learning conversation is a conversation where you're going to bring people together who have different viewpoints on a subject. Mm-hmm. Like, for example, this would be perfect for the Synod of the Family that's coming up.
Yes.
There's some very divergent viewpoints. And there's been discussion about, well, okay, but we need to listen to the people who've gone through this. Okay, so they would know what happened, the feelings, how did it affect their identity. But then we also need to look at our history and our doctrine and how is that affected. But what happens in these kind of settings is you'll take an issue like that, and suddenly, rather than it being dealt with at a debate level, at a contentious level within the media, suddenly you're dealing with it at the level that it touches an individual's life. Now you have a much richer understanding. And so the information that comes out of that, the consultation that comes out of that becomes much deeper. So that's something that we'll consider as we go forward here. Another thing that we want to pay attention to at this point, and what we're doing now is we've gone past the convening stage, maybe we're opening now. We're hearing the party's story, and we're getting a little deeper into it. And so active listening is a key concept where we're not passively listening. What we're doing is we're becoming involved in their story. We're working with them. We want to know it. We want to dig into it. So to drive this, I think a mediator has to be a person who has a great curiosity. They want to hear that story, even if they never resolve this conflict. And they can say this to a party: look, I don't know if I can help you. I don't know if we can reach a resolution on this, but in spite of that, I want to hear your story. I'm very curious about that. And if you have that as a genuine part of who you are, it does affect the parties in a very positive way. And here's where we get to a common situation where we've heard the two stories, and we, as an outside observer, can see that the picture that they have in their mind, it doesn't match. Mm-hmm. So we see there's two different understandings of the same communication. So we realize that mismatch is going to be it's going to make it almost impossible to resolve this. So we need to start working on that. There was a family, it was a probate case, in which I listened and listened, and I could tell it was going nowhere. And I just suddenly stopped the process, stopped the attorney, stopped everyone, and said, you know what's happening here is you're all in the same theater, but you're watching a different movie. And it just went right to the core of the situation. And suddenly the whole process was transformed. And I was able to work with them in a way. In fact, in a very unusual turn of events, the attorney said, you know what, Mr. Stone, would you just work with our clients alone? So they stepped back out of the process, which is it's pretty much unheard of. But it allowed me to then start working on this mismatch. And the mismatch makes people very unhappy. And so you can start to feel it in the process where you're suffering from this communication mismatch. Their parties are not duplicating one another. Doesn't mean they have to agree. It's just, are they understanding what the other person is saying? When he says red, do they see red? Or are they seeing purple? And so you can see this, and you can see the frustration mounting. You can hear people saying, look, I can't deal with you. I can't get through to you. And so at that point, you realize that you need to use your tools and start using the tools of paraphrasing, framing, and coaching them until they are able to see the same thing. And that when they both are hearing and communicating the same thing, there's a great relief that happens. It's like, okay, we got that. They may not agree. Yeah. They may not agree, but at least the communication in many conflicts, this is all you have to do, and it cleans up. But in others, it's not. But at least you take them to this point.
Yeah.
The next slide is a list of communication errors. I'll leave this to participants to just download from the PowerPoint. This is a very good checklist of what might be going wrong. I love the last one, incorrect means of communication used. Nowadays, we see that so frequently, and someone saying, well, okay, I'll text him, or I'll email him, and I'm constantly telling people, no, pick up the phone. An email cannot communicate the nuance of what you're trying to communicate. So all you're going to get is an incorrect means of communication used, and it's going to spiral out of control. Okay. Now, one of the good things, this idea of listening to self, what we've done is we've created an opportunity for the party, because we've let them know we're a neutral. We're not a judge. We're not going to make a decision for them. So now it's a non-defensive. They don't have to present their case. You've asked them, just help me understand the story so I can help you. So it's non-adversarial, and suddenly they can listen to themselves. Now, this is a huge advantage, because if you get into a litigated case, people are not listening to themselves. They are really just, how is this affecting that other party? And yet, in most conflicts, people need to listen to what am I saying? Does that really reflect who I am, what I feel? Or does it ring false? Can I hear, even what I'm saying, does this not hold together? And so in this situation, it allows them to do that. And so they can redraft, which takes us to this area of face work. Face work is a new social science discipline, and it just is a focus on the issues that we see in terms of why do people need to save face, protect face, restore face. It's all of those things. It has to do with respect, and once again, that variable of B. We assessed B, do, have. Face work has to do with B. Now, when we work with face work, what we're trying to realize, or what becomes very clear, is this is one of the main barriers to the parties either coming together or actually engaging in the process. And this is why I've had people say to me, I don't understand why we need mediators. Why can't people just sit down over coffee? Why can't they just sit down and work this out? Part of the reason is face work. There has been a loss of face. So the very act of sitting down with that other party triggers this negative emotion related to face loss. So the parties just start saving face, and the triggers fly up, can't do it. So what a mediator does is restores face. They restore the respect that the person feels. So that's an important step. As we go on, we look at what is face. It's basically our identity. This again is that variable of what we want to be. And it's a public image that we want others to share. It's our claim to be a certain kind of person. It's positive social value we claim. It's a need to be included. Fellowship face. So exclusion basically creates face loss. It's a need to be respected for our competence, and rather than to be invalidated. So this is a very, very hot item, and if you're not skilled at using this, problems are going to come up. I'll tell you one. There's two areas that we should discuss. One is with different cultures, face means different things. In Asian cultures, face tends to be much, much more important. And a loss of face becomes severe, and the conflict escalates greatly. In our culture, in an individualistic culture, it seems to play less of a role, but maybe it just plays it in a different way.
I would agree. For example, some cultures do not appreciate the other party looking them directly in the eye. The eyes need to be subverted, looking down or off to the side or looking above, or even the bowing of the head. all these different expressions, along with personal space.
Yeah.
All these are about saving, protecting face, even restoring face.
Yeah, and body language.
Yeah.
There was one situation which I can share. I was at a parish, and a young woman, and I was waiting to see someone. Young woman came in, and she was just so excited, enthused, and just joyful. She was getting married, and she came in to make arrangements to have a priest marry her. And the staff person at the front desk just got swept up in her joy, and it was really fun to watch. And the staff person was like, "Oh, you know, you have to have Father so and so, celebrate," and just built him up. Well, Father so and so came through the door, and the staff person said, "Oh, this is so and so," and it was like, "Yeah, hi." Boom, and walked right by him.
Oops.
The face,
Yeah.
and you could see it. You could see the face on people just destroyed. Because here she had built and said, "Hey, this is going to be so good for you." And then there was this, unconscious dismissal of the importance. So that's one thing that we can often do is we can create face loss without being aware, and we slip on by it. So we have to be aware of this area, and it's an area to become increasingly aware of. And one of the things that you run into as a problem is if someone admits, like if I'm sitting with someone and I say, "Well, did that created a little upset with you, and that you were kind of insulted," and no, and you could see there was face loss. No, I'm not like that.
Yeah.
That jerk.
Yeah.
He couldn't affect me that way. Because what happens is to admit face loss is to experience it again.
Yeah.
Is to say, I could be a victim and so forth. So a lot of times it'll sit there as a very stubborn variable, and underneath, and the mediator has to just pay attention and move along until the point where you can find the right words to say, were you disrespected? And in one case where it was a woman, and the attorney was not letting us really talk to his client, and I finally had to just punch through and say, this is about respect. And the attorney couldn't stop the response.
It seems that the seminary is having some technical difficulties again this week. 45 minutes into the event, he has just left the conversation, so we'll wait a few minutes to see if Mr. Stone can reboot the system and get the seminary back online. I just received a message saying that my message to him may not have been sent because their server timed out. So we'll just wait a few seconds to see if he either calls me or gets back online. Thank you. Well, while we're waiting for Mr. Stone and Father Clark to come back, I would like to point your attention to the 5 icons at the bottom bottom left-hand corner of your screen. The 4th icon, which looks like a large television screen, is to access the attachments that Mr. Stone was talking about. That is the icon in which you will find a copy of his PowerPoint presentation, along with a copy of the web links that he was talking about. So you don't have to say, Mr. Stone, that was a great presentation. May I have a copy of your presentation? You already have it. Again, you would access it by that 4th icon, which is the large television screen. And there are a number of tabs. One of them says Attachment. You go into that tab and you will find 2 attachments. One of them is his presentation, which you see here. Right now we're on page 24 of 32, so we are exactly 3/4 of the way through. So he's right on schedule. And the second one is a Word document on web links. So that's just additional information for you to have. We'll just wait a few more minutes to see if Mr. Stone can reboot the system or get the Wi-Fi working. It seemed to be a problem with the seminary server or Wi-Fi, from what he said last week. But again, even though we've gone through 3/4 of these slides, all 32 of them are available in the attachment section. I'm waiting to see if Mr. Stone can reconnect, or if perhaps he gives me a call on my cell phone and tells me how he's doing up there. Again, I'll take this opportunity to let you know that this event is being recorded and it will be posted online at the Archdiocesan website by the end of this week. We do have a chat box over on the side. If you have any questions about this event, you can type in your questions in the chat box. Please know that everyone sees everything that is typed. Again, I already talked about the attachments that will be available to you. I took attendance earlier. I see Mr. Stone has come back as a guest. So let me promote him. Okay, Greg Stone is now a presenter again. And Greg, I have unmuted your microphone. Greg, could you say something, please? Your video is paused, Greg.
Okay.
Hi, Greg.
Okay, here we go.
So we are back.
Okay.
I do not see your image.
Okay.
The camera should be coming. It says I should have video. There we are.
Okay.
Oh, you were just there for a second. So I will mute myself, and you can continue your presentation.
Okay, are we back video-wise?
We are back, video and audio. There will just be a gap. The recording has continued.
Okay,
so I did
and
not
our
pause
apologies.
that.
We lost the server here, which happens from time to time, and it takes a minute to get it back up. The next slide goes to the solution that we have for FACE, and this is a unique solution brought to us by St. Francis. There's a term, the face of a Franciscan, which there's a wonderful work by Friar Murray Bodo. It's also in the list of links that I've provided. And he tells the story of meeting with Carl Menninger. Carl Menninger looked at him and said, "You have a Franciscan face." And he was like, "What's that?" You know. And as they talked, he understood that it was the view of Francis, how he saw the divine in every other creature, how he saw that they were endowed with the image of God. And he tells a wonderful story where he went to the airport where he was catching a plane, and he decided to look at everyone with the face of a Franciscan, and the results were startling to him. People just lit up when he looked at him with divine love. So we might call this the gift of divine face. And this is where we move past so many of these face issues, is when we can see past that false self and someone knows that we're really touching who they are. And this is a key concept, and it's something that a good mediator uses all the time, is where we really see the person in front of us at that depth. And we don't buy off on all of the false self phenomena that rush up to greet us. We've actually started, as part of Taming the Wolf Institute, we've created a poster which we're just finalizing, which we hope to get out to Catholic schools. And it takes this idea and uses it in an anti-bullying format. A lot of the time when we talk about bullying, we talk about stopping an action. Whereas with this approach, what we're saying is part of the reason that kids will bully one another is they see that they create an effect. So what we have is the desire to affect someone. And it's real easy when you bully someone, when you taunt them, to see the effect on their face, the upset. And so looking at, okay, that's the negative way that plays out. Why don't we give students a positive way? Why don't we train them so that they can use face to create a positive face? And that's where we introduce St. Francis in terms of being kind and bringing smiles, and that you actually can affect someone. You can create an effect in a positive way. So we just offset it with that way. So that poster is going to be coming out soon. This whole area of face work gets into another area. Go ahead and do it again. There we go. That has to do with what we call I messages. Rather than start the discussion, the story with, you did this to me, you made me feel, you, which causes defensiveness. It just does, from a very practical thing. Instead, we deliver I messages. You know, when that happened, I felt a little dismayed. I felt a little like I wasn't loved. I felt, whatever your story is tell what happened from your point of view. Because the other person can listen to that they can hear. And they may feel bad that they did that. But now you've left the door open. They can join you. Oh, I didn't realize that. Thank you for telling me about that. Whereas if you start with you did, you made whatever that is, that accusation, the doors just slam. And they slam really quickly. And so this is another tool to use called I messages. And an I message is really just a special way of framing. And this is one thing that a mediator is going to do. There was a question. Is one thing a mediator is going to do is frame issues, because a mediator can see that the parties are using language, they're using button pushing, they're triggering the other person. And this is another reason that parties can't resolve their own conflict often, is they get together and they know the buttons to push, and it just starts happening. And so what we want to do is help them frame their issues in a more positive frame, or an acceptable frame, certainly moving them away from triggers. There was a group that started, their name, you could see right away, like, oh, what a bad name. They've changed it since, but they called themselves Real Catholic, something or another. So I don't know if they realize, but the minute you say, okay, Real Catholic, you're implying the other guy isn't. And so you've just started a conflict just using your name. And that's a way that people use triggers, as opposed to, and a mediator starts modeling this. You can tell people about this, but what a mediator does is model it and say, I hear what you're saying. Would it be okay with you if this is the way that we present it to the other party? Yeah, usually it's, yeah, okay, I understand, that would be better. And so often when you're working in separate session and you're going back and forth between the parties, is you're helping them reframe offers, counter offers, reframe the story so that you build an acceptance level, and you also teach them to deliver their message in that way. Part of what we're doing is exercising humility and not judgment. This doesn't mean that we're just falling into appeasement and avoidance, but with humility, what we're saying is we understand life. We understand the context of the world in which you are operating, and so we need to look at things in the broader context and not just arrive at a judgment. We're not a judge, we're a facilitator. And so our listening to their story and handling these things come about in a broader context. Wonderful book called The Humility of God by Elia de Leo. Highly recommended. If you want to do yourself a favor for the feast day of St. Francis coming up this Saturday, pick up a copy of the book, The Humility of God. And she just really explores Franciscan humility and Franciscan spirituality in such a nice way. Now, we get to an area where people, when we start talking about what happened and so forth, we have what's called narrative accounts. People start telling the story, and what they do is they attempt to weaken the link between the self and the transgression. It's all the stories that come up about why I wasn't responsible, or, explaining away how this happened. Now, in our work, we realize that this is just part of the storytelling. The story may need to be revised, but we realize this is how people approach things. Whereas if you're in an adversarial setting, in a court or a hearing or whatever, people dig in here. Yeah. And because the other side goes, that's not accurate, he's lying. And so, and you have a really good attorney with you who can figure out how to impeach the other party, and it just goes off the rails at that point and escalates. Whereas what's really needed is an understanding of, okay, what is the person trying to accomplish by distancing themselves? Well, they're saving face. Maybe they are having a difficult time dealing with who they are, if that's what they did. And so you have this list, and once again, this is something that you can download, of different ways that people deal with this. They may admit that, yeah, that happened, but deny responsibility. Like, well, it happened, but I was just here, and you told me what to do, and it just happened. Or someone may say, yeah, okay, that happened, but come on, the other guy, he wasn't really hurt that bad. And there's different ways of just putting that distance there. And so what we're doing is seeking to help redraft the story in a way so the person can move closer to acceptance of responsibility that is real and yet maintains who they are, and isn't an attempt to impeach or destroy them. We'll discuss in a much later presentation the idea of designing a system. And one thing that we can put forth as homework is to get notes on where do we need to improve as an archdiocese in terms of systems. I'll just throw out one example that's very blue sky, and that's, what if we had an ombudsman? Okay. Often we see within the church setting, we see that someone has a complaint, an upset, and they don't know who to talk to. And there's no one that they can go to talk to in that very neutral way of saying, look, I don't want to file a complaint. I don't want to do that. I just wanted to say, hey, I'm having problems here, and I think that other person needs to be talked to. Well, in the church right now, we kind of are at extremes, which is, either you hold your peace or you go file a report. So there's ways that we can design this that allow people to start having a conversation before they have an escalated conflict. And this is very important, because sometimes, as in the role play that I do with the students here, sometimes a person comes in and they have a complaint, but what's really bothering them is their own faith journey, and they just don't know how to talk about it. I see that we're ending. Thank you, everyone who's attending. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Father Jim.
Thank you, Greg.
You're welcome. I will now stop the recording.